Good evening. As dusk settles and the pace of the day slows, we invite you into a moment of quiet reflection as space, not for alarm or urgency, but for calm understanding. Tonight's journey brings us to a region long marked by historical tension, deeply layered alliances, and now renewed conflict, the evolving confrontation between Israel and Iran. The past few days have ushered in a series of high-stakes developments. Israeli airstrikes on strategic sites in Tehran have prompted not just military ripples, but diplomatic reverberations across the Middle East and beyond. In response, Iran's rhetoric has grown more forceful, vowing retaliation, while firmly rejecting calls for what it calls a surrender to foreign pressure. Meanwhile, former US President Donald Trump has re-entered the discourse urging Iran to comply with international expectations and calling for what he described as unconditional surrender. At first glance, these may appear as echoes of prior confrontations replaying old songs of escalation. But beneath the headlines lie more nuanced chords, new actors shifting power dynamics and uncertain calculations that make this moment worth understanding in full. For tonight, we will not rush through the noise. We will explore it thoughtfully, distilling clarity from complexity. This isn't simply a story of conflict. It is also one of posture perception and power, of how nations respond not just to provocation, but to the invisible weight of history and fear. From the ashes of old agreements to the evolving diplomacy in Washington, from the missile trails over Tehran's skyline to the quiet meetings at the G7 summit, our world is trying once again to navigate the hard path between deterrence and disaster. But we will not begin with alarm. Rather, we begin with curiosity. What has truly changed in the Israel-Iran equation? Why now? And what role does the US, especially its past leadership, continue to play from the shadows? As we move gently into part 2, we will begin uncovering these questions, not to stir unease, but to offer understanding. For in the quiet there is room to think. In the calm, there is room to learn. Let us now begin our exploration, not in haste, but with the patience necessary to grasp the unfolding reality. The recent events between Israel and Iran cannot be viewed in isolation. On the surface, this week's airstrikes by Israel on multiple Iranian military facilities appear as yet another escalation in a decades-old rivalry. But to view them only as an act of aggression is to miss the wider context, both strategic and symbolic. According to verified reports from outlets such as CNN, AP, and The Guardian, Israel's operations targeted suspected missile development sites near Tehran. The strikes were confirmed by satellite imagery and secondary intelligence from both Israeli and independent sources. Tehran has acknowledged damage and civilian impact, though details remain tightly controlled by state media. Notably, Iran's air defenses were only partially successful, hinting at Israeli use of stealth technology or regional coordination. In response, Iranian leadership convened emergency meetings. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei rejected any suggestion of backing down, labeling Israeli actions as violations of sovereignty and part of a broader Western effort to weaken Iran's strategic standing. "This is not the time to surrender," he said, according to domestic broadcasts. Iran's armed forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC), were reportedly placed on high alert. But perhaps most surprising, is the re-emergence of Donald Trump into this geopolitical theatre. While no longer in office, Trump remains a powerful voice among Republicans and a symbolic figure on the global stage. In a press release from his Mar-a-Lago office, he stated that Iran must surrender unconditionally if it wishes to avoid serious consequences. While this statement carries no official weight, it was picked up by several media outlets and responded to by Iranian state television, which framed it as evidence of continued Western hostility. This interplay between military action and rhetorical pressure is not new, yet the stakes feel subtly different now. The Biden administration, while not directly involved in the strike, has expressed concern over escalating tensions. A White House spokesperson reaffirmed support for Israel's right to self-defense, while also encouraging restraint and de-escalation. In parallel, the G7 summit in Canada took on new urgency. Diplomatic sources speaking on background indicated that the Israel-Iran situation dominated private discussions. While leaders were measured in public statements, internal debates reportedly included concerns over potential oil market shocks, risks to maritime trade routes, and the humanitarian implications of a wider conflict. Yet amid this flurry of activity, there is also a quieter story unfolding, a question of timing and coordination. Why now? Why this moment? Part of the answer lies in Iran's expanding regional influence. In recent months, Iranian-backed groups in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have stepped up operations including drone attacks on US bases and commercial shipping. Analysts suggest Israel may have sought to preempt a broader mobilization by degrading command and control infrastructure within Iran itself. Another factor may be domestic. Israel's prime minister, facing both political challenges and ongoing protests at home, may find strategic strikes useful in solidifying national support. Similarly, Iran's government, under pressure from inflation drought and a restless younger population, may view confrontation as a rallying tool that deflects internal criticism. These domestic lenses help us see the actors not merely as nations, but as leaders navigating internal storms, seeking to project strength externally. And through all of this, the shadow of the United States looms large, not just through Trump's statement, but through the lingering memory of past interventions, the Iran nuclear deal, and the complex web of alliances across the region. In the next part, we will examine the layers beneath these actions, the human implications, the strategic calculations, and the broader historical echoes. But already we can sense that this is not merely an isolated flashpoint. It is a moment rich with consequence, shaped by competing visions of security, identity, and power. As we drift further into the depth of this unfolding narrative, it becomes essential to soften our lens and widen our scope, not merely to ask what has happened, but why and what it means. Let us examine with care. Conflict between Israel and Iran is not new. What is new is the choreography of timing rhetoric and risk and interplay of long-standing mistrust reactivated under changing global conditions. From a strategic standpoint, Israel has always treated Iran's growing influence in the region with high alert. Iranian support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen has long been seen as part of Tehran's forward defense doctrine and effort to extend deterrence by proxy. These groups pose an asymmetric threat to Israeli territory and interests, often operating with plausible deniability and wide geographic dispersion. Israel, in turn, has pursued a doctrine of preemption, striking supply chains, training camps, and weapons transfers before they pose immediate danger. This week's airstrikes may thus be interpreted as a continuation of that policy. However, the choice to target within Iranian borders, not just borderlands or proxiesis, a dramatic escalation. From the Iranian perspective, sovereignty is paramount. The memory of past wars from the 1980s to the 2003 invasion of Iraq colors its strategic identity. Iranian officials perceive these strikes not simply as military incursions, but as symbolic threats attempts to undermine their dignity and regional relevance. Khamenei's rejection of surrender is not just political, it reflects a worldview in which resistance is a form of survival. Here we begin to see the contours of tragedy. Two nations locked not only in material opposition but in psychological defense. Their actions are shaped not just by current politics but by inherited fears of betrayal, encirclement, and existential threat. Now let us consider the human layer. Inside Iran, ordinary people are already grappling with economic pressure. Sanctions have left vital goods scarce and inflation rampant. Young Iranians, educated, digitally connected, often politically skeptical, find themselves trapped between a conservative regime and uncertain foreign pressure. They do not vote on foreign policy, yet they bear its consequences. Israeli strikes may weaken military infrastructure, but they also reignite nationalist sentiment, forcing many citizens into symbolic unity with a government they otherwise question. In Israel, too, life is fragile. Cities remain under periodic threat from rockets. Families routinely live with sirens and shelters. While Israel's military strength is formidable, the civilian experience of conflict is deeply personal. Many Israelis remember the trauma of earlier wars or carry the burden of military service. Thus, public support for defensive actions can rise quickly, but so too can war fatigue if conflict drags on without clear resolution. And then there are the broader ripples. Oil prices, already unstable from global supply chain shocks and climate-related disruptions, are beginning to tick upward. The Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly one-fifth of global oil passes, sits perilously close to the theatre of conflict. Insurance premiums on shipping routes have risen. Investors are cautious. While no immediate crisis has struck the global economy, uncertainty looms, subtle but palpable. In the United States, this conflict arrives at a complex moment. The Biden administration, though cautious, must navigate a domestic political landscape where foreign entanglements are viewed skeptically. Public trust in interventions has diminished since Afghanistan, and yet American allies look for reassurance. European nations, particularly France and Germany, have called for restraint and a return to diplomacy. Others, like the United Kingdom, echo support for Israel's security while urging proportionate response. And then there is the voice of Donald Trumpian official, yet undeniably influential. His call for unconditional surrender may not represent official US policy, but it complicates the narrative. For Iranian media, it reinforces the image of a hostile West. For Trump supporters, it affirms a hardline stance they believe was missing under current leadership. For allies and analysts alike, it injects unpredictability into an already unstable equation. Yet despite this tension, hope glimmers through the fog. Back-channel talks are reportedly underway. UN envoys have reached out to both sides. The Vatican quietly is said to be preparing a statement urging moral leadership and the sanctity of life. In diplomatic circles, the words cooling period and confidence building are being quietly revived. And here we return to the beginning, not to fear, but to understanding. Each side believes it is defending something sacred. Each believes it is acting out of necessity. But understanding this does not mean excusing violence, it means seeking a path that breaks the cycle. As we transition into part 4, we will imagine gently, not what will happen, but what could happen. For in imagining there is wisdom, and in wisdom perhaps the seeds of peace. Let us now pause in the middle of this still and silent night to explore possible futures, not as predictions but as invitations to imagine what may come. Hypothetical thinking, when used gently, can illuminate the range of choices still available to us, even amid tension. What if cooler heads prevail? In this scenario, diplomatic backchannels, perhaps facilitated by a neutral European state or a coalition of mediators, help bring both Iran and Israel back from the edge. Iran, while maintaining its rhetoric, may agree to international inspections of its recent missile programs, signaling a temporary de-escalation. Israel in turn halts further strikes and participates in a new framework of deterrence agreements involving regional powers like Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE. This wouldn't bring permanent peace, but it could mark a return to the managed tension model of the past. Unstable, yes, but short of war. Oil markets would stabilize. G7 nations could refocus on climate and development goals. And most importantly, civilians across the region would be spared the uncertainties of open conflict. What if the United States takes a more active but measured role? In this path, the Biden administration, aware of both global concern and domestic reluctance, chooses a calibrated engagement. The US might appoint a special envoy for Middle East deconfliction, tasking them with shuttle diplomacy across Jerusalem, Tehran, Doha, and Ankara. Trump's commentary would remain in the background, possibly shaping partisan rhetoric, but not official statecraft. Such involvement, if executed with nuance, could ease tensions while reminding allies of America's strategic presence. It would not resolve every issue, but it might slow the spiral, and that in moments like this can be enough. What if escalation continues? In a more worrisome scenario, Iran retaliates through regional proxies rather than direct strikes. Rockets from southern Lebanon or drones over the Red Sea might test Israel's resolve. Israel could respond disproportionately, pulling in Hezbollah or even Syrian actors. The risk of miscalculation grows. Global powers would likely scramble to contain it. China, with growing economic stakes in the Middle East, might urge restraint from Tehran. Russia, balancing its relationships with both Iran and Israel, could push for a ceasefire. Yet even in this troubling vision, there is a path back, perhaps through emergency UN negotiations or pressure from regional civil society. What if the voices of ordinary citizens begin to shape the outcome? This final what if is perhaps the most quietly powerful. Imagine Iranian students protesting not only domestic repression, but the dangers of foreign conflict. Imagine Israeli reservists voicing concern about the direction of national policy. Imagine American voters insisting on diplomacy over confrontation in the next election cycle. While slow, such public sentiment has redirected history before. In these imagined futures, there is space for agency, not just from governments and militaries, but from people who choose day by day not to surrender to inevitability. As we prepare to close, let us carry these possibilities like soft lanterns, each a light in the fog, reminding us that while outcomes are uncertain, they are not beyond influence. And now, as the lights dim and night deepens, we arrive gently at the close of our reflection. We have traveled together through headlines and histories, through tension and imagination. And yet, despite the heaviness of the themes, let us end not in despair, but in quiet possibility. The conflict between Israel and Iran remains a knot in the fabric of international relations, one woven from decades of mistrust, fear, ideology, and pride. The days ahead may still carry moments of escalation or uncertainty, but the human spirit, so often tested by such tensions, continues to seek paths forward, paths marked by restraint, empathy, and endurance. History teaches us that even in the darkest chapters, there are those who choose to build bridges, diplomats who write late into the night, journalists who seek nuance over noise, families who simply long for safety. And in every society, from the hills of Galilee to the streets of Tehran, from Capitol Hill to quiet living rooms, there are voices calling softly for peace. As for the role of the United States, it remains one of responsibility and reflection. Whether through active diplomacy, silent pressure, or the restrained choice not to overreach, American influence will continue to shape outcomes. And within that influence lies the chance not to dictate the future, but to create space for it to unfold wisely. For Donald Trump, his presence in the narrative serves as a reminder of how leadership, past and present, lingers in the air. His words, though unofficial, reflect a perspective still alive in American discourse. But tonight, our attention returns to quieter things, not statements meant to provoke, but the quieter choices meant to prevent harm. So let us return to where we began, a gentle evening, a curious mind, and a hopeful heart. As you prepare to rest, know that understanding the world is not only a task for policymakers and strategists. It is also a quiet act of citizenship, a nightly ritual of listening and learning. And in doing so, we equip ourselves not only with knowledge, but with compassion. Thank you for joining this evening's reflection. May you sleep peacefully, and may tomorrow arrive with clarity, courage, and calm. Good evening. As night draws near, let's settle quietly into the unfolding developments between Israel and Iran. Tonight's gentle exploration centers on recent cross-border airstrikes, missile salvos, diplomatic ripples, and the evolving role of former President Donald Trump's voice in this delicate moment. We begin with a calm breath, reminding ourselves that while headlines may pulse with tension, deeper understanding can offer perspective. Imagine skies over Tehran and Tel Aviv alight not with drama, but with urgent alerts. Israeli jets struck nuclear and military facilities in Iran on June 13th, ramping up to daily confrontations. Iran replied with missile barrages, some breaching Israel's Iron Dome. His words offer a crossroads between the reassurance of decisive leadership and the latent risk of inflaming tensions. In this bulletin, we will explore 5 chapters, an introduction that gently situates us, a guided deep dive into unfolding events, an in-depth yet serene analysis, reflective what-if scenarios, and a hopeful closing that lifts as much as informs. With each moment, we invite calm curiosity, multiple perspectives, and a quiet readiness for tomorrow. And yes, Part 1 quietly echoes itself. soft echo of our intent. We will soon move deeper, tracing the threads of action and diplomacy, but always in a tone that soothes rather than shouts. Now that we've gently set the stage, let us begin the journey into the deeper currents moving beneath the headlines. At the heart of this week's developments lies a sequence of military escalations unlike others in recent memory, not only for their intensity, but for the speed with which both Israel and Iran appear to be acting and reacting. Yet beneath the roar of jets and the arc of missile trails lies a quieter set of questions. Why now? Why this time? The events began in earnest on June 13th, when Israeli forces launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against targets near Isfahan and Natanz locations associated with Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Israel's message was stark but familiar: prevent Iran from progressing toward a nuclear weapon. But this time, the strikes were more aggressive, more targeted, and unmistakably public. Iran, long used to covert cyber-sabotage or isolated attacks, found itself confronting a very overt challenge. Iran's response was swift and determined. Missile systems launched salvos toward key Israeli cities. While the Iron Dome intercepted the majority, a few found their way past defenses. Videos circulating on social media verified by independent sources show flashes in the sky over Tel Aviv, followed by faint, distant booms. Israel responded again, this time with further strikes targeting ballistic missile infrastructure deep within Iranian territory. The cycle of action and counteraction had begun. What complicates the scene is not only the geography and firepower, but the geopolitical layering. Israel, though operating alone militarily, is not isolated diplomatically. Statements of support from the United States and several European partners reinforced Israel's right to self-defense, while calls for restraint from China and the United Nations highlight the precariousness of escalation. Meanwhile, Iran's allies, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and certain paramilitary factions in Iraq, hinted at joining the conflict if it continues. Their rhetoric remains ambiguous but undeniably sharper. And in the midst of this, Donald Trump's entry into the conversation has drawn attention not just for what he said, but when and how. Speaking at a campaign-style event in Florida, Trump declared that Iran must unconditionally surrender or face consequences the likes of which they've never seen. He further advised American citizens in Tehran to leave within 48 hours and called on all peace-loving nations to support Israel's effort. Though no longer President Trump's influence remains potent, especially among conservative media and certain policy groups in Washington. This raises subtle but important dynamics. Is Trump positioning himself as a shadow diplomat, offering bold statements where official channels hesitate? Or is he seeking to amplify his political relevance as the US heads toward the 2026 midterms? Both may be true. His rhetoric adds a layer of complexity. It both rallies his supporters and signals to adversaries that American resolve might outlast any one administration. Public reaction across the US has been mixed but largely subdued. Some see Trump's statements as necessary shows of strength in a dangerous moment. Others worry that such language could box in future leaders or inflame the situation further. Yet in the silence between these views lies a shared desire for peace, or at least stability. Returning to the central question, why now? Analysts suggest a convergence of triggers. Iran's nuclear program reportedly reached a new threshold with enriched uranium levels approaching weapons-grade capacity. Israel, always wary of timelines, may have judged this moment as a narrow window to act before options closed. Simultaneously, internal unrest in both countries, economic and political, may have contributed to a readiness for distraction or demonstration of force. Still, this is not a region unfamiliar with cycles of escalation. What makes this episode distinct is the clarity with which it has unfolded. There are no covert operations, no deniable actors. Instead, the world watches two nations openly confront one another, with global leaders, markets, and civilians all holding their breath. Let us carry this understanding gently into the next section, where we'll explore in depth the human impact, the diplomatic chessboard, and the quieter signals behind louder events. As we now find ourselves immersed in the heart of this unfolding situation, let us pause not to dwell on fear, but to explore its layers with the clarity that evening reflection allows. The conflict between Israel and Iran, though framed in terms of missiles and statements, is also deeply human, felt in neighborhoods, markets, classrooms, and quiet evening prayers disrupted by the thrum of distant danger. First, we consider the civilian toll. Iran's health ministry has reported more than 200 casualties following Israeli airstrikes, most concentrated around Isfahan and the outskirts of Shiraz. Hospitals have struggled with intermittent power, and some health centers were damaged during nearby blasts. The images, verified by international agencies, depict shattered windows, twisted steel, and the pale dust of collapsed masonry. Yet, amid the wreckage are stories of calm resilience, a school teacher guiding children to shelter, a nurse holding vigil beside an injured child, a call to evening prayer rising again over rubble-strewn courtyards. In Israel, while the scale is numerically smaller, the psychological impact runs deep. Some missiles evaded interception, striking neighborhoods in Haifa and causing injuries, though mostly non-fatal. One such missile struck a parking structure, damaging homes but sparing lives. The sirens, a familiar yet still harrowing sound, returned with unwelcome frequency. Families once again spent nights in stairwells under reinforced ceilings. Israeli civil defense teams, practiced and swift, resumed their solemn duties, checking debris, guiding the elderly, reassuring the anxious. In parallel, international diplomacy has awakened. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session, though predictably divided. Western nations expressed grave concern over Iran's nuclear ambitions, while Russia and China called for an end to Israeli aggression. The language of diplomacy can be coded, but the tone was unmistakably tense. Still, channels remain open. Swiss and Omani intermediaries, often quiet but pivotal, have begun shuttling messages. There are whispers of temporary ceasefire proposals. None confirmed, but in diplomacy, even whispers matter. The economic ripples are widening. Global oil prices climbed nearly 7% since the first strikes, reflecting fears of prolonged instability. Both Iran and Israel lie near vital shipping routes, and insurers have already adjusted risk premiums for tankers passing through the Persian Gulf. Stock markets showed volatility, though not panic, a testament perhaps to learned resilience in a world that has weathered its share of crises. But not all consequences are measured in numbers. In Washington, debates have reignited over US engagement in the Middle East. The Biden administration has maintained cautious language supporting Israel's right to defend itself while urging maximum restraint. Behind closed doors, defense officials have increased readiness levels at key US bases in the region, particularly in Qatar and Bahrain. US diplomats have reportedly reached out to Turkish, Saudi, and Emirati counterparts seeking avenues for de-escalation. Meanwhile, Trump's messaging has stirred deeper debates. While his calls for unconditional surrender appear extreme, they resonate in certain segments of the American electorate. Analysts point out that Trump's language mirrors a broader theme in his political approach: clarity over nuance, pressure over patience. Whether one agrees or not, this approach forces attention. It also raises ethical questions. Should a former president intervene so publicly during an international crisis, or does his continued influence reflect the evolving nature of political power in the US, one that transcends office? For those watching from afar, especially in Europe and Asia, the conflict is a signal of uncertainty. Governments in Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo have all issued travel advisories. Indian and South Korean diplomats are working to evacuate citizens from Tehran. And yet, even in these precautionary steps, there is a notable absence of panic. Perhaps the world, though weary, retains a cautious optimism that leaders will blink before the brink. Still, it is worth remembering that neither Israel nor Iran truly seeks total war. Both have domestic pressures that encourage short, forceful engagements rather than prolonged campaigns. In Israel, Prime Minister Eliav Darban faces criticism over housing prices and judicial reforms. In Iran, President Mohseni contends with youth protests, inflation, and sanctions fatigue. For both, conflict can be a distraction, but only briefly. Too much risk, too little reward. So we find ourselves at a fragile intersection, one where strength and diplomacy, public posturing and private pleading all move together in a shadowy dance. And through it all, people wait. In cafes, shelters, embassy lobbies and newsrooms. They wait not for victory or surrender, but for stillness, for mourning, for a chance to breathe again. We carry these reflections now into the next part, gentle but curious, where we ask, what if, not to alarm, but to imagine other paths this story could take? As twilight deepens into night, we turn to contemplation, not of dread, but of imagination. This portion of our journey is one of gentle what-ifs. These are not predictions, nor are they prescriptions. They are meditations on possibility, carefully balanced between realism and hope. What if amid the dust of missile strikes and the echo of warnings a temporary ceasefire were brokered in the coming days? It is not out of reach. Switzerland and Oman have successfully served as back channels in past crises. The US, even in cautious tones, continues to maintain strong diplomatic reach in the region. Perhaps under the veil of night quiet, conversations are already underway. Messages exchanged not through press conferences but through intermediaries with long memories and even longer patience. In that scenario, we might see a pause, not a resolution, but a breathing space. Humanitarian aid could reach damaged areas. Civilians might emerge not with confidence but with a flicker of reprieve. And most importantly, regional actors such as Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE might seize the moment to convene a peace forum. There have been stranger openings in history. The Camp David Accords, after all, began in secrecy. What if alternatively the conflict persisted another week? Not escalation into full war, but a continuation of low-intensity strikes and responses. Oil markets would likely grow more volatile. Civilian displacement might increase modestly, especially near border regions. The global diplomatic community would be forced to act even symbolically. We might see increased pressure on the UN to deploy inspectors or the reactivation of dormant nuclear monitoring proposals. Such a path would not bring collapse but fatigue, a kind of sustained unease, not unlike past moments in the region's long and complex history. It would test the resilience of ordinary people more than it would shift borders or redraft treaties. Then there is a darker possibility, one we entertain only briefly and cautiously. What if a miscalculation occurred? A missile veers too far. A target is misunderstood. A civilian site is struck in error. These are the tipping points history records with grave headlines. Yet even in such moments, de-escalation has occurred before or after the Beirut barracks bombing, after the US downing of an Iranian airliner, after assassinations that threatened broader conflict. In all those moments, leaders stepped back from the brink, not always from wisdom, sometimes from weariness or pressure or fear. Still, they stepped back. Lastly, and perhaps most quietly, what if this moment became a turning point? What if the shared trauma of this conflict gave way to new discourse, not just among leaders, but among citizens? Across social media and digital town halls, younger voices, Persian and Hebrew alike, have expressed more empathy than anger. Some share music, poetry, even videos of common childhood games. It is not naive to imagine peace beginning there. Peace has begun in stranger places, the soccer fields of Belfast, the folk songs of the Balkans, the vigil candles outside war-torn churches. These what-ifs do not bind us, but they do guide us. They remind us that the future is never one road, but many. And even when that road runs through shadow, moonlight can still find the edges. Let us carry this imagination forward into a final reflection, a gentle landing, a soft good night. And now, as the world quiets and the final thoughts of the day settle in, we turn our gaze gently toward tomorrow. In the face of conflict fatigue and shifting rhetoric, there remains something enduring, the steady pulse of human resilience, the quiet insistence that tomorrow must be different, not because we deny hardship, but because we hope beyond it. Hope in this context is not a naive gesture. It is grounded in precedent. In 2006, during the Israel-Hezbollah war, the guns paused, not due to victory, but exhaustion, and in that pause, new norms of engagement were forged. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, however flawed and short-lived, proved that even bitter adversaries could reach consensus when the world offered structure, incentives, and accountability. These are not illusions, they are reminders. Tonight there are those still awake in Tehran and Tel Aviv, mothers, students, taxi drivers, aid workers. Some will not sleep easily, but most will rise tomorrow and continue. In the smallest acts, opening a store, sweeping a step, helping a neighbor, they participate in a kind of resistance more profound than any military maneuver, the refusal to let conflict define their daily life. In Washington, new conversations are underway. Congressional leaders, both Republican and Democrat, have begun convening on emergency briefings. Not all their intentions align, but most agree on a common premise. The Middle East remains too vital, too complex, and too deeply intertwined with global affairs to be viewed in binary. Even in polarized times, there is still space for sober consensus. It may be slow, but it is not absent. For Donald Trump, his re-emergence into this narrative marks a return to familiar themes: strength, urgency, confrontation. But even his boldest declarations cannot overshadow the delicate balance at play. Whether as a potential leader once more or a figure casting long shadows from the past, his words will now be weighed not only by supporters, but by generals, diplomats, and everyday people navigating uncertainty. There will be further statements, more press briefings, likely another round of retaliations, but beyond that, there may also be moments of restraint that never make headlines. A decision not to launch, a delay in retaliation, a closed-door agreement. These too are acts of influence. These too shape the future. So tonight, as we lay down these words, let us remember that analysis is not prophecy. It is a companion to awareness, a map, not the road. We do not pretend to know what dawn brings, but we know that history is shaped not only by what happens, but by how it is remembered, how it is told, and how it is felt by those who lived it. To those listening or reading in the hush of night, may your rest be gentle, your reflections grounded, and your hope intact. The world turns even through uncertainty, and somewhere amid the dust and declarations, new understanding may be quietly taking root. Good night. Good evening. As the day draws to a peaceful close, we turn our thoughts toward a story unfolding far from home, a story shaped by layers of history and hopeful for thoughtful peace. Tonight we begin with a delicate yet compelling hook, a high-stakes moment between Israel and Iran, with voices urging both force and restraint. Over the coming minutes, we will gently explore the contours of this tense moment, sharing quiet reflections grounded in calm clarity. Well, start by listening to the core of what has happened, then explore deeper meanings. Well, consider how actions in one corner of the world ripple outward. Well, balance facts with compassion and evidence with context. As we unfold the layers, our aim is to offer understanding without alarm, insight without urgency. This evening is about bringing awareness to your restful routine, illuminating without disturbing. Some may first imagine scenes of conflict, but tonight, let's allow gentle curiosity to open the door. Over the next hours, we'll reflect on the recent strikes in Iran and Israel responses in capitals near and far, and how US voices, especially former President Donald Trump, are shaping the narrative. We'll also invite calm analysis: what might come of this, and how can diplomacy find space amid sharp exchanges. For now, take a moment to settle in. Feel the quiet of your surroundings. Well, revisit these questions gently. Why did this escalate? Who feels its weight? What flickers of hope remain? Our journey will unfold in 5 graceful parts. By its end, we'll leave you with warmth, a sense of resilient continuity, and reasons to meet tomorrow with thoughtful openness. In this first segment, we simply set the stage. We acknowledge complexity without rushing into conclusions. You may notice echoes from previous news cycles. The shadow stretch of regional tensions, shifts in leadership rhetoric. But tonight, we allow ourselves to slow down. The aim is not to convince, but to invite awareness, to hold the pieces softly in mind. As we transition toward the next part, you may reflect on your own sense of connection to a world beyond your window. That is enough for now. When you're ready, we'll begin exploring the unfolding events themselves, the who, what, where, and why, always with gentle pace. One or two gentle sentences echoing previous content, we've opened the story tonight with a view toward understanding over alarm. Now that we have settled into a quiet awareness, let us begin our gentle exploration of recent events. Over the past few days, tensions between Israel and Iran have taken on a sharper tone, marked by swift action-pointed rhetoric and an undercurrent of uncertainty. The most recent development centers on an Israeli airstrike deep within Iranian territory, reportedly targeting facilities believed to be involved in drone production and missile operations. Iran, in turn, has signaled both its outrage and resolve, though the full spectrum of its response remains cautious and calibrated. These exchanges are not unfamiliar. For years, Israel and Iran have engaged in what many describe as a shadow conflict, a series of proxy engagements, cyber skirmishes, and isolated military actions carried out with varying degrees of visibility. What makes this latest episode distinct, however, is its visibility and its timing. The strike was bold public and met with a noticeable pause in both countries' internal political rhythms, as if both sides were momentarily bracing for something larger. Within the United States, eyes have turned once again to Donald Trump, whose statements on international conflicts, especially involving Iran often, carry a resonance that surpasses the formal limits of his current private citizenship. In a recent address, Trump called for Iran's unconditional surrender, a phrase that echoed wartime declarations of the 20th century delivered with his characteristic clarity and provocation. His critics called the language inflammatory, his supporters called it strength. As ever, the lines remain clear, but the consequences of such words ripple unpredictably. At the same time, some Iranian officials have hinted, however faintly, at the possibility of negotiation. This comes amidst internal pressure from the country's struggling economy, the enduring impact of international sanctions, and a youthful population weary of conflict. There is a subtle tension within Tehran itself, pride and defense of sovereignty balanced against the quiet realization that prolonged escalation could be devastating, particularly if it derails efforts to stabilize food, water, and medical supplies already in precarious condition. Meanwhile, Israel faces its own internal reckoning. The political leadership, while largely unified on national defense matters, is navigating global scrutiny and the concern of allies. Some within the Israeli security establishment have quietly warned of overreach, while others argue that preemptive strikes are necessary for long-term safety. The United States has signaled both support and restraint, encouraging Israel's right to defend itself, but also expressing concern over regional destabilization. This complex web draws in more than just those two nations. The Gulf states, Russia, China, and the European Union all watch carefully, not just for what happens next, but for what tone is set. Will this be the spark that hardens lines for years to come? Or will it serve paradoxically as a reminder of the need for deeper dialogue? To understand this moment, we must view it not as a flashpoint, but as part of a continuum, part history, part political calculation, part human longing for security and clarity. Every drone launched or intercepted, every speech delivered or withheld is part of that continuum. It is through this lens that we will now move more deeply into the heart of the matter, examining why this is happening, who is most affected, and how it might reshape what comes next. To understand why this moment matters and what deeper patterns are emerging, we must look gently but closely at the layered history and motivations behind the actions unfolding today. The tension between Israel and Iran is neither new nor unintentional. It is shaped by decades of mistrust, strategic calculation, and opposing visions for the Middle East. But beneath these grand narratives lie quieter, more personal forces, the choices of leaders, the pressure of domestic politics, the anxieties of ordinary people, and the silent hope that tomorrow might be calmer than today. Why did this happen now? One contributing factor is the evolution of military technology. Over the past few years, Iran has significantly expanded its drone capabilities. These drones, ranging from short-range tactical models to long-range systems, have been deployed in various regional conflicts, often through proxy groups in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Israeli officials have watched this development with growing concern, viewing the drone infrastructure as a direct and evolving threat. Thus, the recent airstrike targeting drone assembly sites was not only a warning, it was a message intended to disrupt a capability before it matures further. But there is another dimension. Israeli intelligence assessments have suggested that some of Iran's weapons facilities are embedded in or near civilian zones, making their neutralization ethically and diplomatically fraught. In this particular strike, Israel appeared to calculate that the strategic gain outweighed the potential international backlash, especially given the limited physical destruction reported. That such decisions are made at all, however, speaks volumes about the fragile balance between deterrence and escalation. And then there is the political context. In Iran, the government is walking a tightrope. On one side, it projects strength and resolve to an international audience, particularly its domestic base of hardline supporters. On the other, it must manage a nation exhausted by inflation, frustrated by censorship, and increasingly vocal about transparency and reform. President Ebrahim Raisi's administration is keenly aware that miscalculations, either by underreacting or overreacting, could ignite internal unrest. That awareness might explain why Iran has so far chosen rhetorical responses over military retaliation. But restraint should not be mistaken for passivity. Iran's cyber capabilities, regional influence, and diplomatic channels all remain in motion, quiet perhaps, but never inactive. In the United States, this evolving moment arrives in the heat of an election season. Former President Donald Trump, as a key contender for 2024, continues to speak with a voice that shapes the global perception of U.S. intent. His recent remarks, which cast the situation in sharp moral terms, suggest a return to his maximum pressure doctrine. And yet, behind those bold words lies an electorate divided not just by party, but by fatigue. Many Americans today view foreign conflicts with a sense of cautious distance, not because they don't care, but because they carry the memory of long, costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is within this tension between rhetoric and realism that US foreign policy must navigate. The most directly impacted, as always, are the civilians. In Tehran, families scramble for information as internet outages roll through districts. In Tel Aviv and Haifa, parents explain to their children why sirens sometimes sound in the night. In border regions of Iraq and Syria, militias reposition as rumors ripple. And in embassies around the world, staff prepare talking points designed to calm markets and allies. The human cost, though not always seen, lingers beneath each headline. And yet even now there are positive elements. Quiet diplomatic overtures, often through third parties like Oman or Switzerland, continue behind the scenes. Back-channel communications, often dismissed in public, play an essential role in reducing misunderstandings. Analysts have pointed out that despite the aggression, neither side has attacked core infrastructure or issued official declarations of war. This suggests a shared, if unspoken, line neither wishes to cross. Indeed, the tone of this confrontation matters as much as the content. As we reflect tonight, we might ask, what would this situation feel like if shaped more by mutual recognition than by fear? What if the same resources devoted to conflict were rechanneled into climate resilience, water access, and public health across the region? Let us not dismiss these questions as naive. They are instead deeply practical and deeply human. Peace is not the absence of strikes or the silence of speeches. It is the willingness to see across a border or a belief system and recognize the shared future that binds all lives. One or two gentle sentences echoing previous content. Even amid strikes and speeches, there are traces of restraint, and with them the possibility of a different path. As we move gently into the realm of possibilities, we step away just slightly from the world as it is and begin to consider the world as it might be. What if the next moves were not shaped by retaliation, but by recognition? What if the momentum we see so often assumed to point toward conflict could instead be turned with deliberation, even imagination? Let us begin with a quiet hypothetical. Suppose in the days ahead, a mediator nation, perhaps Switzerland or Qatar, were to convene a confidential dialogue between Iranian and Israeli representatives. Not a formal summit, not a press conference, just a conversation. What might emerge from that room? It is possible that the two sides would reaffirm their positions, exchange warnings, or even leave more hardened than before. But it is also possible that something simple, even fleeting, might take place, a shift in tone. A recognition that both sides, however different, share a desire to avoid a larger war. Now let us reverse the lens. Suppose the opposite happens, that in the absence of dialogue, further military actions occur. Another strike, a counter-strike. The rhetoric hardens, airspace closes, civilian panic spreads, markets tumble. In this world, the consequences grow, not from one act alone, but from the accumulation of reactions. Neither side intends a full-scale war, yet both inch closer to one because neither is willing to risk appearing weak. This has happened before. We know its shape. And so awareness of this path is not fear-mongering, it is simply foresight. A third scenario exists too, one that is slower, quieter, and possibly more realistic, a long cooling period. In this future, both Iran and Israel engage in a sort of strategic pause. Each builds defenses. Each communicates cautiously. They avoid escalation without embracing reconciliation. Over months, this equilibrium becomes a kind of informal agreement, not ideal, but survivable. The world grows used to it. Life continues with tension in the background. And yet there is also a fourth pathone that may be less discussed. This is the future shaped by unexpected voices. Artists, students, doctors, diaspora communities. Imagine if instead of statements from generals or ministers, we heard more from those who treat the wounded or teach the young, or write songs about the dreams of ordinary people. What if the voices shaping this moment were not only those in power, but those most affected? This fourth path is not naive, it is simply quiet, and that is why it is so often overlooked. But sometimes the most transformative movements begin not with declarations, but with a shift in perspective, a sense of shared vulnerability. A poem translated across borders, a video of neighbors helping neighbors. Even in a world of missiles and warnings, such moments matter. They do not erase conflict, but they remind us that conflict is not the only story. We are not predicting outcomes tonight, we are simply asking what if. And as you reflect on these gentle possibilities, allow yourself to hold them without judgment. Let them sit beside the facts, not to replace them, but to soften their sharp edges with imagination. And now, dear listener, as the night deepens and the pulse of the world slows to a softer rhythm, we arrive at the final stretch of our journey together. Here in this last reflection, we let the facts and hypotheticals settle like dusk over the horizon. What remains is not just what has happened, but what we choose to carry into tomorrow. The story between Israel and Iran is still unfolding. It may shift suddenly or slowly fade back into the quiet back channels of diplomacy. We do not yet know. But what we do know is that moments like this, tense, uncertain, and fraught, offer us a choice. Not as governments or armies, but as observers, citizens, and neighbors. We can allow ourselves to become numb to the cycle, to see conflict as inevitable. Or we can choose gently and persistently to remain aware, to care, to look past the headlines toward the quiet humanity beneath them. This awareness is not passive. It is powerful. When we take the time to understand, when we listen instead of judge, when we resist the urge to rush toward opinion, we contribute to a world more capable of peace. No speech or strike can undo that quiet work. As we prepare to rest tonight, consider the small lights that remain even in uneasy times. Diplomats working long hours behind closed doors. Journalists risking their safety to provide clarity. Medical teams in war-touched regions who still show up day after day, not knowing if the sirens will sound. Consider also the resilience of those who do not speak on behalf of nations, but who live within them, parents, teachers, elders, and youth, all hoping that tomorrow might bring even one less reason to be afraid. And if you are far from these events, if your life continues uninterrupted by the weight of sirens or sanctions, you are still part of this story. Because peace, like conflict, belongs to all of us. It is a collective inheritance shaped by the choices we make in how we speak, think, vote, and empathize. Let this be our closing note, not of certainty, but of continuity. May we greet the coming days not only with awareness of what is happening, but with intention about how we respond. There will be more news, more headlines, more decisions. But tonight, in this still moment, we can choose gentleness. We can choose curiosity. And above all, we can choose to imagine a better outcome. Sleep well. May your rest be deep and your thoughts open. Thank you for spending this evening in calm reflection with us. Good evening. As twilight settles over cities and countryside alike, and the day's pace begins to slow, we invite you to step into a space of gentle reflection. This is not the clamor of breaking headlines nor the hurried pulse of urgent alerts. Rather, it is a soft unfolding of the world's deeper stories, ones that matter not only in the corridors of power, but also in the quiet corners of our consciousness. Tonight, we begin by opening a delicate page in the book of international relations, one that gently flutters between caution and confrontation. As reported by several outlets, including NBC News, former President Donald J. Trump recently made comments that caught the attention of global observers. His words touched on the tense and long-standing relationship between the United States and Iran, specifically the possibility of launching a U.S. military strike in the wake of Israeli action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. It was not an announcement, but rather a weighing of possibility. I may do it. I may not, he said. A phrase as ambiguous as it is potent. To many, such remarks carry echoes from the past shadows of 2018 and 2019, when rhetoric between Washington and Tehran reached feverish heights. But what does it mean today in 2025 to hear such words again? Are they political, signaling a strategic bluff, or the seeds of a path no one wants to tread? And how does this moment, fleeting as it may seem, connect with larger currents of diplomacy, deterrence, and domestic discourse? We won't race toward conclusions. Instead, we'll walk slowly through these questions, taking the time to consider what's beneath the surface. The aim is not to predict war or peace, but to understand what this moment asks of us. Well, follow the thread from Trump's remarks to their geopolitical context. Well, consider how leaders speak not only to enemies abroad, but to audiences at home, and well touch on the symbolic weight of language in fragile times. In the soft light of this evening, there's room to breathe and think. Yes, the topic is heavy military tensions, nuclear sites, the spectre of escalation. But here we hold space for calm understanding. No matter your views on Donald Trump, US foreign policy, or Iran's role in the region, there is something grounding about examining these events without alarm. We can choose to engage with care and clarity. As we begin, remember, news like dusk does not demand panic. It invites awareness. Tonight we step into that awareness together. And now, gently, we carry forward with a closer look at the events and implications unfolding behind the remarks. We begin our closer look by returning to the words themselves spoken by Donald Trump during a recent interview, "I may do it, I may not." In the realm of international relations, ambiguity can serve many purposes. It can buy time. It can confuse adversaries. It can shore up support at home while avoiding immediate responsibility abroad. In this case, the context was, Iran's continued development of its nuclear capabilities, specifically tied to its underground enrichment facility at Fordow-Ready, a subject of long-standing concern among Western governments. The remarks come at a time of heightened tension in the Middle East. In recent weeks, Israel has reportedly carried out covert airstrikes on suspected Iranian military infrastructure and nuclear sites. While Israeli officials rarely confirm such operations, US intelligence leaks and satellite imagery have offered strong corroboration. Iran, in response, has threatened decisive retaliation and deployed additional air defense systems around key locations. It is in this atmosphere of unease that Trump's comments emerged not merely as political bluster, but as a potential prelude to something larger. The core of the matter rests on a delicate triangle: Israel, Iran, and the United States. Israel has historically maintained a posture of unilateral defense. Never again, as the ethos of preemptive action often goes. Iran, for its part, continues to frame its nuclear ambitions as peaceful, while its support for regional proxy groups such as Hezbollah and the Houthis adds to the sense of instability. And the US, across multiple administrations, has danced between diplomacy and deterrence, between sanctions and strikes, red lines and resets. Former President Trump's latest remarks are complicated further by his current political positioning. Though not in office, he remains a central figure in American political discourse and a potential frontrunner for the Republican nomination. His foreign policy record, marked by the withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal (JCPOA) and the subsequent maximum pressure campaign, continues to influence how Iran views American reliability and intent. For Iran's leadership, Trump's voice is not background noise. It is a potential future to plan against. What also makes these developments especially relevant is the backdrop of upcoming elections in both the US and Israel. In times of political transition or uncertainty, foreign policy decisions, especially those involving military force, can become entangled with electoral calculations. The idea of a rally around the flag effect is well documented. Leaders facing internal dissent or electoral risk may find external conflict to be a means of consolidating support. Whether such motivations are present here is speculative, but the timing is hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has issued statements that underscore Tehran's unwillingness to capitulate. In a recent televised address, he referred to Western demands as colonial echoes and reasserted the Islamic Republic's strategic patience and strength. He also warned that any aggression would be met with a regional response, hinting at the possibility of mobilizing allied militias in Iraq, Syria, or even Lebanon. The complexity of the region, with overlapping alliances, sectarian tensions, and historical wounds, makes any such escalation unpredictable. And then there's the broader context, the global stage. Other powers, Russia, China, the European Union, watch closely, each with its own interests. China, for instance, has sought to play a mediating role between Iran and Gulf states in recent months, driven in part by its growing reliance on Middle Eastern energy. Russia, deeply entangled in its own geopolitical calculations with Ukraine and the West, maintains close ties with Tehran, particularly in areas of military technology. The European Union, still a proponent of reviving the JCPOA, remains diplomatically engaged but limited in leverage. In this web of cautious gestures and assertive moves, Trump's ambiguity takes on multiple meanings. Is it a signal to Iran, a warning to Israel, a message to voters, perhaps all at once? That, in many ways, is the nature of modern power, rarely linear, often layered. As we continue this exploration, it's important to hold all these threads gently. We're not forecasting doom nor dismissing the weight of these dynamics. Instead, we're simply laying them out, allowing space for understanding to bloom. And with that, we move further into a more thorough examination of how this moment came to be, what it reflects, and where it may lead. To understand how we arrived at this point, where a single phrase from a former US president reverberates through geopolitical halls, we must journey through the currents of history and recent decisions. This is not the first time US-Iran relations have stood on the edge of tension. In fact, the relationship has been defined by cycles of confrontation, negotiation, and cautious distance ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But while the patterns are familiar, the current context brings unique elements worth considering. Let's begin with Fordow, the Iranian underground facility, mentioned quietly in many briefings, but looming large in strategic conversations. Built deep beneath a mountain near Qom, this site is designed to survive aerial bombardment of the reasons it symbolizes both defiance and deterrence. When Donald Trump exited the JCPOA in 2018, Iran resumed activities at Fordow, including enriching uranium to levels far beyond the original agreement. While Iran insists the enrichment remains for civilian purposes, many experts, including those from the IAEA, have voiced concern that the enrichment level is approaching weapons-grade capability. This alone is troubling, but what adds complexity is the difficulty of verifying intent. Nuclear capability as a technological threshold does not always equate to weaponization. Nations such as Japan and South Korea possess the technical ability to produce nuclear weapons, but have opted not to owing to security guarantees and diplomatic strategy. Iran, however, operates in a different trust environment, facing regional isolation sanctions and repeated military threats. Its leadership often views nuclear capability as both a bargaining chip and a shield against regime change. Israel's position, on the other hand, has been resolute. Regardless of shifting administrations, Israeli policy has consistently emphasized that it will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. The memory of past existential threats still shapes Israeli defense doctrine. As such, preemptive strikes, whether cyber-like Stuxnet covert assassinations or aerial as seen in Syria, form a cornerstone of its response matrix. The challenge, however, is that each action risks escalation, especially when Iran retaliates through regional proxies or direct threats. Now consider the United States' evolving role. While the Biden administration has oscillated between pressure and diplomacy, the broader U.S. posture in the region has shifted away from large-scale military presence. Afghanistan was an inflection point. So too is Ukraine, where U.S. attention and military resources are increasingly focused. This relative drawdown leaves space and sometimes ambiguity about America's willingness to intervene militarily in the Middle East. Trump's recent comment, ambiguous though it is, touches precisely on this uncertainty. One might ask, who gains from such uncertainty? For some political analysts, ambiguity is a form of leverage. By not declaring a firm course of action, Trump may seek to keep adversaries guessing, perhaps encouraging Tehran to reconsider its path or testing the resolve of Israel. Domestically, it plays to his base as a leader who is both assertive and unbound by conventional diplomacy. To critics, however, such comments risk reigniting dormant conflicts and undermining years of diplomatic groundwork, not only with Iran, but with allies uncertain about US strategic consistency. Meanwhile, the human dimension should not be lost. For millions of civilians across the Middle East, whether in Iran, Israel, Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon, the fear of war is not abstract. Airstrikes, economic sanctions, power shortages, and displacement are daily realities. When a global power shifts its tone or posture, the ripple effects can shape school reopenings, food prices, hospital capacity, and more. In Tehran, the sound of an air raid siren isn't a strategic metaphor, it is a real possibility. In Tel Aviv, shelters are not relics, they are maintained, supplied, and practiced. Despite this fragility, there are currents of optimism. Back-channel diplomacy continues between US allies and Iranian negotiators, often facilitated by Oman or Switzerland. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have slowly re-engaged Tehran in efforts to de-escalate regional tensions. These are not headline-grabbing moves, but they form the slow scaffolding of peace-building. Even within Iran, younger generations continue to push for reform, openness, and a redefined national identity that is less adversarial and more globally integrated. In the United States, too, foreign policy voices remain diverse. Within the Republican Party, opinions vary widely, from hawkish interventionists to realists wary of overseas entanglements. Among Democrats, there is ongoing debate about whether engagement or containment is the wiser path forward. In this sense, Trump's comment is not just his alone, it lands in a landscape of political and ideological fluidity. So where do we go from here? That is the question we now turn toward, not with urgency, but with a quiet curiosity. Through what-if scenarios that illuminate the stakes without stoking fear. Let us pause now, not to worry, but to wonder. Sometimes the most powerful tool for understanding complex realities is to explore gentle hypotheticals, scenarios not meant to predict, but to expand the mind. What if the United States were to strike Iran? This question is more than military. It is deeply political and logistical. A direct US military strike, likely aimed at facilities such as Fordow or Natanz, would require precision intelligence coordination and readiness for swift retaliation. Iran's likely response would come in waves: missile launches targeting US bases in Iraq or Syria, cyber attacks on infrastructure, and possible actions by Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. Oil markets could spike, trade routes may briefly be disrupted, and regional governments such as Jordan and Turkey would face pressure to take sides. But would this scenario inevitably lead to war? Not necessarily. Past engagements between Iran and the US, like the 2020 drone strike that killed General Qasem Soleimani, have led to retaliation, but not full-scale war. Both nations have historically shown restraint once the costs of escalation became visible. A similar pattern could emerge again, though the risks remain high. What if Trump were re-elected in 2024 and followed through on his remarks? Should Trump return to office, his Iran policy would likely reflect his earlier strategies: maximum pressure withdrawal from multilateral frameworks and unpredictable rhetoric. However, the world in 2025 is not the same as in 2016. China is more entrenched in the region, Russia's alignment with Iran is tighter, and America's global image has shifted post-Afghanistan. A unilateral strike in such a climate might further isolate Washington even from traditional allies. Yet Trump has shown willingness to act outside diplomatic consensus. Would such action deter Iran, or entrench it further in defiance? What if Iran agreed to return to a nuclear deal in exchange for sanctions relief? This is a quieter, more hopeful possibility. A restructured agreement, perhaps not as comprehensive as the JCPOA, but rooted in mutual guarantees, could restore inspections, freeze enrichment at safe levels, and unlock frozen assets for humanitarian use. Trust would be hard-won, but the precedent exists. Oman and Qatar have expressed willingness to mediate such frameworks. With rising domestic pressure, Iran may eventually view economic relief as more critical than enrichment milestones. The US too might find benefit in restoring a degree of regional stability without boots on the ground. What if Israel acts alone again? If Israel launches another round of covert or overt strikes, Washington may find itself pulled into a reactionary role. This could complicate US diplomatic efforts or force it into a mediating position between partners. Iran, meanwhile, may perceive such actions as having US approval, escalating the blame and response beyond just Tel Aviv. In this sense, Trump's words become even more significant. They shape perceptions of American complicity or distance. What if no one acts and time passes? This is perhaps the least discussed but most common outcome. In many past cycles, rhetoric surges, actions are threatened, and then quietly, steadily, attention shifts. Technical talks resume. Deadlines pass. The world watches, then looks away. It's not glamorous, but sometimes non-escalation is a decision in itself. Not a failure of resolve, but a quiet preservation of peace. Trump's comment, "I may do it, I may not," may end up a moment of political theater absorbed by the machinery of diplomacy and forgotten in the long arc of restraint. In each of these cases, the variables are vast. But one constant remains: the human desire to avoid war, even in a world conditioned to its possibility. With these reflections gently folded into thought, we approach the final movement of our journey, a transition from uncertainty to calm hope, from questions to quiet continuity. And now, as night deepens and the hush of evening fully settles around us, we arrive at a gentle closer space, not of endings, but of stillness and thoughtful pause. The journey we've taken tonight has carried us through shadows of uncertainty and into the soft light of deeper understanding. We began with a phrase, "I may do it, I may not." Words from a former president, yes, but also words that mirror a broader global posture, tentative, watchful, filled with unspoken conditions. In a world where diplomacy and danger often coexist, ambiguity can be both a tool and a burden. Yet we have seen how even the most charged scenarios contain layers beyond confrontation. Each player, whether Iran, Israel, the US, or observers beyond, moves not only through strategy, but through history, identity, and domestic reality. Behind each state are people, families, teachers, artists, farmers, young adults, grandparents. In every nation that holds a seat at the global table, there are those who simply hope that their children wake up tomorrow to peace. And in this hope lies something enduring. There are no guarantees in geopolitics. Leaders change, coalitions shift, and rhetoric can harden or soften with the winds of economy and elections. But there are also enduring truths. Diplomacy takes time. War is costly. And trust, though fragile, is still possible. The fact that we are able to discuss these possibilities to weigh outcomes rather than brace for inevitability is itself a quiet sign of balance. So what can we carry into sleep from this? Perhaps just this, that tonight no bombs have fallen, that even in the face of stark choices, conversation continues. That ambiguity, while unsettling, also leaves room for wisdom to prevail. And that there are always voices, diplomats, scholars, citizens, working often quietly to keep the world from breaking. As you rest, allow yourself to release the heaviness of headlines. Let the knowledge rest lightly. You are not alone in caring about what happens next, and the future is not yet written. If history teaches us anything, it is that people, when given space and care, often choose peace over chaos. So tonight, may your sleep be steady. May your dreams be rooted not in worry, but in curiosity and calm. And may you awaken with the same quiet clarity we've held in our time together. Until tomorrow, good night and be well.